Studies on dystopian novels such as Brave New World in 1984 generally focus on the same handful of questions. To what extent did these narrative omens from the past come true? Which is a more effective means of controlling society, oppressive or repressive mechanisms, technology or ideology, militarism or scientism? Considering the fact that these dichotomous questions are unwieldy and impossible to answer definitively, we may find it more rewarding to use these types of novels as a means to critically analyse our own time, rather than merely trying to answer the question, who got it right? The general thesis of this essay is that, although Huxley in his 1932 novel Brave New World believed that it was a centralised and top-down form of scientifically empowered oligarchy that would lead to a loss of freedom in society, the same outcome can occur and is occurring in a decentralised or neoliberal society. This is to say that, in broad terms, Huxley outlined a means, a scientifically controlled society, to an end, a society in which the individual no longer has freedom, and humanity has become inhuman. Precisely the same exact issues Huxley believed we were facing, such as the infantilization of society, anti-intellectualism prevailing, a loss of moral and ethical systems, the undermining of love, a devaluing of artistic pursuits, and an overall loss of human autonomy has occurred, not as a result of complete state control, but from the exact opposite, from the free market system. As Huxley wrote himself in his follow-up analysis, Brave New World Revisited, there are many roads to Brave New World. Neoliberalism is a political doctrine which is encompassed by the types of policies pursued by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Its key attributes involve a desire to shrink the capability and responsibility of the state in managing society, facilitated through the privatization of state utilities and enterprises, as well as pursuing deregulation and financialization, allowing the free market to operate in more areas of society and with fewer constraints. Neoliberal policy was coupled with neoliberal ideology, which is encapsulated by Margaret Thatcher's infamous statement, "There is no such thing as society." Strong trade unions and a generous social welfare system were both seen as a hindrance to economic prosperity, and therefore enemies to freedom and liberty. Figures such as David Harvey believe that neoliberalism is the hegemonic doctrine of our current society. He says, "There has everywhere been an emphatic turn towards neoliberalism in political, economic practices and thinking since the 1970s. Deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common." He quotes Margaret Thatcher's statement that economics are the method, but the object is to change the soul. Understanding how the souls of the denizens of Brave New World are changed will allow us to comprehend how neoliberalism has changed our souls. Now we shall explore a few of the key themes in Brave New World and see to what extent these reflect our own times. While Huxley's novel recognises the symptoms of our times, the signs of a debased society and culture, it failed to identify the correct etiology or the origin of what would lead to such a debasement. Rather than focusing on the narrative or structure of Brave New World, this essay will focus precisely on vignettes and themes of the novel in order to allow for more acute parallels to be drawn. The status of intellectualism in the 21st century is a curious one. In Brave New World, we witness a scene early on where children are conditioned to fear books through a means of Pavlovian conditioning. The presence of paperbacks is coupled with shocking explosions and electrocutions in order to ensure the discomforting sensations are forever associated with literature. Yet, for our society, it is as though this rejection of literacy has occurred covertly rather than overtly. A recent YouGov poll found that only 54% of Americans read at least one book in the year 2023. Other polls have found that there is a decline in the amount of books read each year. What makes this even more curious is that access to literature has never been wider, with computers and smartphones allowing access to digitized books, and volunteer endeavours like Project Gutenberg making a vast array of literature available free of charge. Yet people are reading books less and less. We may speculate that, rather than as some state-led campaign of Pavlovian conditioning, this has occurred merely due to the economic laws of coercive competition. As the resident controller for Western Europe says in Brave New World, you can't consume much if you sit still and read books. On the rare occasion that people still read books, they often opt for celebrity autobiographies, self-help books, and crime fiction. This is not to denigrate those genres, but rather, what's significant is the gradual disappearance of a distinction between art and entertainment. Writers who churn out airport novels are appointed to judge supposedly prestigious literary awards. The latest releases from pop musicians, superhero films, and the ghost-written musings of celebrities are all discussed and analysed with the depth and rigour that used to be reserved for literature and high art. To quote Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, the fusion of culture and entertainment that is taking place today leads not only to the deprivation of culture, but inevitably to an intellectualization of amusement. This is important to note. It is not that it is bad to critique and analyse popular or commercial pieces of entertainment. To some extent, to do so is more important than ever. It is, however, a sign that things are out of joint when engagement with entertainment replaces or supplants engagement with serious works of art. In a sense, the intellectualization of amusement is not just a sign of commercialization, but also a symptom of the fact that, while there are a few people who foreclose on intellectual pursuits altogether, many people still harbour a deep hunger for intellectual engagement, yet are too exhausted from the exploitative labour practices suffered under neoliberalism, and too short on time due to the constant distractions the cacophonous world of technology subjects us to. The next best thing to seriously engaging in intellectual works, which takes time and energy many people don't have the privilege of possessing, is to be sold cheap entertainment as though it were works of high cultural value. Books are largely sanctioned in Brave New World, with only the highest caste, alphas, permitted to read them, and even then, the literature is constrained to dull textbooks rather than Shakespeare. However, newspapers, radio, and television are actively promoted by the state. Huxley describes the newspapers: the hourly radio, an upper caste sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and on khaki paper, and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. The idea of a newspaper being published hourly is comical, but is this not merely a reflection of digital newspapers? No longer are they published daily or weekly, but instantaneously and constantly. We could suggest that the neoliberal analogue to an hourly newspaper is social media itself in the forms of Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc. In one chapter, Lenina is informed by her friend that the controller objects to anything intense or long drawn. Although this is primarily intended to be with regard to sexual relationships, we can also see it reflecting most forms of media in Brave New World. Newspapers are ideal for a controlled society because they can be pored over with ease, unlike a book which requires longer and deeper engagement. Social media is the entity par excellence for allowing engagement without investment. One can easily check Twitter or Instagram without much intellectual strain being demanded of us, which is why it is so appealing to check them when one is unfocused and tired. There is also thematically a dichotomy of noise and silence in the novel, which is itself symbolic of the erasure of solitude in a society where everything is increasingly public. Bernard Marx's desire for doing things in private is described as mania. While on a date with Lenina, Bernard Marx grows weary with the societal compulsion to always be around others, seeking to have privacy with Lenina. On the way back from a sporting event, the semi-demi-finals of the Women's Heavyweight Wrestling Championship, he hovers over the waters of the Channel in his helicopter with Lenina. Gazing upon the waves and the clouds, Lenina is appalled by the rushing emptiness of the night, by the black, foam-flecked water heaving beneath them, by the pale face of the moon, and reflexively turns the radio on. Since she seems to have been more effectively psychologically conditioned than Bernard, she is compelled to reject quietly contemplating a sublime scene of the natural world. Bernard complains that the radio's beastly noise stops him being able to look at the natural scene, explaining that it makes him feel not just a cell in the social body, indicating how contemplation can give one a sense of identity. As with the radio in Bernard Marx's helicopter, we have progressed technologically to the point where we can subject ourselves to the chatter of podcasts, social media, and news 24/7 with the use of mobile devices. We can experience the public world at any time from anywhere. In itself, This is not necessarily pernicious, but it contains the potential to inhibit the possibility of solitude and contemplation. It's not uncommon now to remark upon accidentally leaving one's headphones at home with a sense of terror, as though being alone with one's thoughts is to be subjected to a level of torture comparable with waterboarding. But this psychological intolerance for solitude is somewhat inevitable when we are surrounded by and constantly subjected to technological means of distraction. As Herbert Marcuse writes, "Solitude, the very condition which sustained the individual against and beyond his society, has become technically impossible." Huxley notes in Brave New World Revisited, a book he wrote almost 30 years after publishing Brave New World, reflecting on the parallels between real life and the novel, "In Rome, there was nothing like the non-stop distraction now provided by newspapers and magazines, by radio, television, and the cinema." It's hard to disagree with the notion that this dynamic has continued, and even deepened in the 21st century. One key difference from the distracting media of the 20th century, however, is that these were primarily passive distractions. The 21st century is the age of interactive distraction, of which social media is the best example. Bertrand Russell once reflected that the pleasures of urban populations have become mainly passive, seeing cinemas, watching football matches, listening to the radio, and so on. This results from the fact that their active energies are fully taken up with work. If they had more leisure, they would again enjoy the pleasures in which they took an active part. Social media at first appears to be a type of liberation from the passive media of the past. However, it comes with severe restrictions. The move from the passive media of the 20th century to the active media of the 21st century comes with a trade-off. You can take part, you can join the conversation, but you must be restricted to writing only 280-character posts on Twitter, to posting only pictures and videos on Instagram, perhaps with a short caption, and to posting short videos on TikTok. One key facet of the neoliberal era is the privatization of the commons, or the use of what should be a public utility for private gains. Most criticisms of the exploitative nature of social media focuses on the extraction and selling of a user's data as the most egregious transgression. However, we may consider that the fact that the content on these platforms are created by users, of course willingly, is one of the most exploitative features. The fact that many forms of social media are constrained to short-form, immediate types of content guarantees that nothing of depth or nuance can be said, which in turn drives users to create spectacles rather than insights. On the effects of the restriction to the short form on social media, we may consider the lyrics of a recent song by Arab Strap. "I come to you for confirmation, testimony, adulation, education, excitation, palpitation, and flirtation, but you give me aggravation, insult and disinformation, hatred, bias, and predation, suicidal ideation." Because the algorithms of these social media are essentially blind, geared towards engagement of any sort, positive or negative, they are able to impose the black and white, flattened one-dimensionality of Brave New World without any need for a government to intervene. It is in fact by the virtue of the absence of government intervention that this desolation of the public forum is able to proceed, and of course the withdrawal of government intervention is one of the key tenets of neoliberalism. In our time, the problem is not one of too much government control, as suggested by the political structure of Brave New World, but rather the absence of government intervention. A wide array of new media appear in Brave New World, and many are featured in the following passage describing a hotel which Bernard Marx visits. Liquid air, television, vibro-vacuum massage, radio, boiling caffeine solution, hot contraceptives, and 8 different kinds of scent were laid on in every bedroom. The synthetic music plant was working as they entered the hall and left nothing to be desired. A notice in the lift announced that there were 60 escalator squash racket courts in the hotel, and that obstacle and electromagnetic golf could both be played in the park. This array of diversions brings to mind the wide range of so-called consumer choice, which is touted as one of the benefits of neoliberal society. In addition, there is a huge emphasis on the sensational and the stimulating rather than the contemplative or intellectually nourishing. The film, or feelie, which they watch, is named 3 Weeks in a Helicopter, an all super singing, synthetic talking, coloured, stereoscopic feelie with synchronized scent organ accompaniment. It is incredibly immersive, integrating all of the 5 senses in the experience. In the book Immediacy, or the Style of Too Late Capitalism, Anna Kornblue identifies immediacy as a new trend within culture and media. She states that, in the current climate, art renounces its own project of mediation. Directness and literalism are the techniques. Immersiveness and surety are the effects. She describes the recent Van Gogh immersive experience thusly. Van Gogh's quotidian images, utmost colour saturation, and mental distress are not enough to generate an adequate sensory encounter. Sweat and endorphins must pump that regular spectating into multimedia multitasking vinyasa flow. In this flexible hypersensory coordination, the bounds of medium unfold. The work of art becomes indistinguishable from its installation and the corporeality of its spectators. While the aesthetic experience stretches towards total engagement, mixing miasmic emanation, everything simultaneously without rest or distinction. Painting, panting, impressionism, immersion, gallery, studio, exhale. It is all art, there is no art. The connection between the nature of media in Brave New World and neoliberalism begins to become clear. Both the feelie of Brave New World and the Van Gogh immersive experience seek to overcome the limitations of their respective forms of film and painting. It is not enough to look upon and contemplate the image. One must tear apart the frame and, as it were, jump directly into the picture. Bernard even later remarks on how you feel the people kissing in the film. It is as though we have forgotten the words of G.K. Chesterton. Art consists of limitation. The most beautiful part of every picture is the frame. However, this liquefaction of culture, the commodification of art into experience, comes not from the technocratic powers of the state as suggested by Huxley, but rather by the constant necessity for capital valorization. When no area of society is protected from the impulse of commodity exchange, inevitably art and culture become mere raw materials to be transmogrified into whichever form offers the most opportunity for profit. This can also be seen in the trend to turn every figure in history into the star of their own biopic, or in the trend for the work of artists to be emblazoned upon pillows, t-shirts and tote bags. We may also suggest that the proliferation of new media are in part a reflection of what Herbert Marcuse referred to as false needs. As he explains in One-Dimensional Man, the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and consume in accordance with advertisements, to love and hate what others love and hate, belongs to this category of false needs. This sentence easily maps onto the reality of Brave New World, although advertisements would need replacing with state propaganda, and even then, advertising is merely propaganda produced by corporations rather than governments. Positivism is essentially the belief that the natural sciences, such as biology and chemistry, and empirical studies, the ability to quantify rather than to qualify, are the superior means to understand and manage society, rather than the human sciences, such as linguistics and philosophy. The approach to philosophy in Brave New World is summed up in the line, "Not philosophers, but fret sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society." The perception of philosophy in the general zeitgeist of the 21st century is that it is at worst dead, as proclaimed by the late theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, and at best a form of self-help rather than a way of understanding the world. This is reflected in the revival or popularization of Stoicism as self-help, and figures like Jordan Peterson, who appear to be more interested in giving everyday life advice rather than truly investigating the nature of being. With philosophy relegated to a position of either a pastime or as self-help, scientists seem to have occupied the vacuum it has left in the task of understanding the nature of the world. Again, Stephen Hawking said that scientists, rather than philosophers, have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. In the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer dissect how the promise of the Enlightenment transformed into a new form of mythology. The hope that rationality would prosper over superstition resulted in a new form of superstition. In Brave New World, the new form of superstition is exemplified as the veneration of Henry Ford as a religious figure. Rather than years being measured in AD, short for Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, years are measured in AF, or after Ford. Instead of exclaiming, "Oh God," characters exclaim, "Oh Ford." Citizens of Brave New World make the sign of the T, as in the Ford Model T, rather than the sign of the cross. Although Huxley probably intended the supplanting of God by an industrialist and business magnate as more of a metaphor than a literal prediction, this has more or less become true in the sense that many revere Elon Musk as a messianic or godlike figure. With faith in religion waning and the uncertainty of the fate of civilization rising, some choose to put their hope in the techno-industrialists. Hypnopedia, a type of conditioning through repetitive phrases played out of speakers, is used in Brave New World to enforce state propaganda. Analogous to this, we can consider ChatGPT. Bernard remarks that 62,400 repetitions make one truth. In a literal sense, he simply means that this is the amount of times one needs to hear a hypnopedic phrase for it to be learnt by rote and established in the mind. However, this merely additive form of truth could be seen as a metaphor for the status quo. One example of this is the common line trotted out to justify neoliberal austerity by politicians, the idea that a country has maxed out its credit card, which appeals to common sense, but makes no sense in actual economics, since the government lends money to itself. But the idea that truth is merely repetition is essentially the principle governing the creation of ChatGPT. By using, or rather stealing, huge amounts of data and using machine learning to create a model which can predict the most likely response to a query, ChatGPT forms a kind of status quo machine which is touted to be intelligent. But this truth is only true insomuch as any aggregation of data into a middle ground can be true. If large language models existed in the time of Galileo, they would be asserting that the sun revolved around the earth, as was commonly believed at the time. Assertion of the status quo often takes the form of untruth. In One-Dimensional Man, Herbert Marcuse notes, "The universe of discourse is populated by self-validating hypotheses, which, incessantly and monopolistically repeated, become hypnotic definitions or dictations." The use of hypnotic, of course, brings to mind the hypnopedia of Brave New World, but it also parallels ChatGPT's tendencies to rely on truisms, clichés, and what is already established, rather than developing new forms of thought or understanding. In this longer passage, Herbert Marcuse is criticizing the language of total administration which pervades modern society. The elements of autonomy, discovery, demonstration, and critique recede before designation, assertion, and imitation. Magical, authoritarian, and ritual elements permeate speech and language. Discourse is deprived of the mediations which are the stages of the process of cognition and cognitive evaluation. The concepts which comprehend the facts, and thereby transcend the facts, are losing their authentic linguistic representation. Without these mediations, language tends to express and promote the immediate identification of reason and fact, truth and established truth, essence and existence, the thing and its function. He attributes this type of deprived discourse to defense laboratories and the executive offices, the governments and the machines, the timekeepers and managers, the efficiency experts and the political beauty parlours. We can extend this list to include ChatGPT itself, which is literally an exercise in imitation. It contains the capacity to designate and assert, and also cuts out the possibility of mediations, the process of cognition and cognitive evaluation. The evaluation is complete on the user's behalf, with no need for them to exercise their own mental faculties. Ironically, Huxley himself seems to take somewhat of a positivist stance in Brave New World Revisited. In spite of all his fears about science supplanting art, history and culture with regard to how a society seeks to understand itself, he succumbs to an overemphasis on what he would refer to as biology in order to explain the development of society. As the 20th century wears on, as the new billions are added to the existing billions, there will be more than 5.5 billions of us by the time my granddaughter is 50. This biological background will advance ever more insistently, ever more menacingly, towards the front and centre of the historical stage. Huxley seems to take the political philosophy of Thomas Malthus quite seriously, whose name adorns the contraceptive belts within the novel. The idea that merely an increase in population leads to a loss of freedom in society arbitrarily discounts the influence of political, societal, and historical developments as both the potential cause of unfreedom and the way out of it. In a similar sense, pseudoscientific evolutionary biology, another type of simplistic biological determinism, is often invoked in our own time to justify the free market principles of neoliberalism, with fallacious comparisons to natural selection and animal hierarchies. The scope of this work, however, does not permit us to go beyond conjecture on this topic currently. In Brave New World, eccentricities are viewed as arising from biochemical causes rather than simply being unique personality traits. The protagonist, Bernard Marx, is frequently subjected to the speculation that someone put alcohol into his blood surrogate, which perhaps touched his brain. Similarly, in our times, it's not uncommon to speculate that eccentric dispositions or quirks in behaviour are due to the neurobiology or structure of the brain. Depression is often described as being caused by the brain's inability to produce adequate serotonin, which can be corrected by a pharmaceutical drug such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. However, this hypothesis has largely gone unproven in scientific studies. Although Bernard Marx could be understood as a figure who is unable to fit into society because of his brain chemistry, as suggested, Huxley leads us to infer that his inability to go along in society is rather because he rejects the society in which he lives. The use of psychiatry to justify the conditions of a given way of life has occurred throughout society, whether it being political dissidents in the Soviet Union diagnosed with creeping schizophrenia as a means to deny their rational objections to an oppressive society, or suburban housewives in the United States being diagnosed with depression and prescribed antidepressants, or even lobotomized as a means to force them into their roles as mothers and homemakers, rather than recognizing the legitimate reasons for their dissatisfaction with society. It is also notable that the idea of happiness as the primary goal of society is something reflected both in Brave New World and capitalist society, which in the latter case is embodied by Slavoj Žižek's formulation of the super-egoic injunction to enjoy, which proliferates under capitalism. The drug of choice to treat suffering in Brave New World is Soma. When Bernard Marx protests against the banality of the society he inhabits, his peers suggest that he is in need of a dose of Soma. We can consider the purpose of the drug Soma in relation to the prevailing medicines of our own time, whether that be antidepressants, stimulants, or opioids. One area in which Brave New World seems to differ entirely from neoliberal society is that the somnolent and inactive state induced by Soma is seen as acceptable and desirable. A large enough dose, known as a Soma holiday, can render a user incapable of any productive activity. On the contrary, the diagnostic criteria of depression and ADHD, which often necessitate a prescription of antidepressants or stimulants, is often explicitly designated with one's abilities to be a productive worker, and the goal of the medications are often to restore the patient to their productive role in society. Whereas Soma keeps people in line through pleasure and relaxation, antidepressants and stimulants can have the effect of papering over legitimate social concerns with a neurochemical solution. Soma does facilitate the consumption of consumer goods in Brave New World, but Huxley overlooked the idea that a drug which facilitates labour could also equally serve as a means to repress and quell resistance. A YouGov poll in 2015 showed that 37% of British workers think that their jobs are meaningless. Is it surprising that so many people are then struggling psychologically and are unable to maintain productivity at their place of work? One widely noted effect of amphetamines is that it makes dull work more interesting. It is possible that those who are dissatisfied with the state of their role in society, the nature of their work or home life, have legitimate concerns, which are all too often then medicalized and treated on an individual rather than societal basis, much as Bernard Marx's dissatisfaction is individualized, medicalized, and dismissed. This amounts to an enforcement of the status quo. Many people also adopt the use of amphetamines in order to enable them to work harder or study more effectively. As the nature of free market competition encourages individuals to exploit their own brain chemistry for the sake of coming out on top. Contrary to what Huxley thought, Soma would prove an ineffective drug for social control. In the 1960s, the British subculture of mods used amphetamines in order to extend their leisure time into the early hours of the morning. In the neoliberal era, it seems that we now use amphetamines not for leisure, but for labour, to increase our capacity to work. Our drug of choice is one that facilitates self-exploitation and productivity rather than relaxation, and overwork may prove to be a more effective means of enforcing the status quo than relaxation. One of the slogans ingrained into the inhabitants of Brave New World through the means of hypnopedia, a form of Pavlovian conditioning, is "Everyone belongs to everyone else." This is a manifestly socialist or even communist mantra, so how can we reconcile this when it appears to stand in complete opposition to the neoliberal mantra of "there is no such thing as society"? Paradoxically, although a demand to conform can constrain freedom, equally, the absence of society is also a path to unfreedom for individuals. We can even twist the slogan of Brave New World into a neoliberal form. Nobody belongs to anyone. Under individualism, it is not one's responsibility to society which matters, but merely one's duty to oneself. The pre-neoliberal era can be thought of as embodied by the post-war consensus. After World War II, in both the US and the UK, the state took on a role in providing social safety nets in the form of increased welfare and state institutions like the National Health Service in the UK. In the United States, President Eisenhower followed the spirit of Roosevelt's New Deal, advocating for minimum wage and social housing and creating state-led infrastructure projects like the interstate highway system. But as the state withdrew from the role of governing society in the 1980s, emphasis began to shift onto the duty of individuals rather than communities. The belief was essentially that if you allow the free market to take over the necessary reproduction of society, the profit motive and the laws of supply and demand will ensure that production is efficient and therefore will benefit everyone. However, a brief survey of the private healthcare system in the United States, the state of the cost, quality, and distribution of housing in the United Kingdom, or the detrimental ecological effect of profit-led companies, will show that the profit motive is far from perfect and has inefficiencies of its own. To return to Brave New World, one way in which the fictional dystopia is starkly different to our own world is in its class or rather caste system. Each denizen of Brave New World is biologically determined to have mental and physical capabilities reflecting their relative caste, each caste being named after a letter in the Greek alphabet from alpha to gamma. Alphas are generally knowledge workers who are permitted positions of power and are the only strata who are allowed to read books, whereas gammas are left to more menial tasks such as machine work. It is also important to note that each caste is indoctrinated to enjoy their own position in society. You may expect a caste society to be one where the highest enjoy luxury and freedom, and the lowest have to bear the brunt of the work and labour, similar to the positions of aristocrats and serfs in a feudal system, for example. However, in Brave New World, those on the lowest rung do not have to work too hard. Upon John the Savage asserting that the lower castes have awful work, Mustafa Mond replies, "On the contrary, they like it. It's light, it's childishly simple. No strain on the mind or the muscles. 7.5 hours of mild, unexhausting labour, and then the Soma ration and games and unrestricted copulation and the feelies. What more can they ask for?" In summary, the caste system of Brave New World is one of rigid designation, with no possibility of moving outside of one's position, no social mobility, but in which each is indoctrinated into enjoying their position, which is how stability is achieved. John the Savage goes on to query why they don't make every human the highest possible caste, Alpha Double Plus. Mustafa Mond explains that in Cyprus they experimented with an alpha-only society, which resulted in strikes as people rejected low-grade work and eventually concluded with a civil war. So by means of biological control, psychological manipulation, and not too strenuous work, the project of a stable yet unfree society is achieved. Neoliberal society is almost the exact opposite of Brave New World in all these attributes. Rather than the government predetermining people's position in society, it has been left up to the free market to decide which strata of the class structure people inhabit. Furthermore, social mobility is touted as a positive, which in some sense it is. But often we are given the sense that if one is at the lowest rungs of society, it is because they have not worked hard enough. It is rarely remarked upon that social mobility cuts both ways. One may find the opportunity to scramble up the ladder of class, but equally we can slide down the rungs of the ladder into the lower classes. The fear of negative social mobility may prove to be a more effective means of societal control than the rigid caste system of Brave New World, since it encourages self-exploitation and in some sense results in less solidarity or even negative solidarity between workers. The status quo is maintained not through work being simple and resources being plentiful, but rather through the fear of losing one's position and the resources, or rather distribution of them, being scarce. In a Guardian article from 2014 titled "Neoliberalism has brought out the worst in us," Belgian psychoanalyst Paul Verhagen notes that neoliberalism has an infantilizing effect. In Brave New World, infantilization is actively encouraged. Bernard remarks that they are compelled to be adults intellectually and during working hours, but infants where feeling and desire are concerned. Outside of working hours, the denizens of Brave New World are occupied with banal entertainment such as the feelies, the pacifying intoxication of Soma, and trivial pastimes such as electromagnetic golf. Thereby, they are reduced to infants when not in the world of work. Although, given the lack of autonomy the citizens of Brave New World have in their workplace, one could equally argue that the workplace is a place of infantilization also. This is embodied in a scene where a scientist's work is destroyed for going beyond the standard expectations. The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel and highly ingenious, but heretical and, so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive, not to be published. He is punished for thinking for himself, which is one of the markers of intellectual maturity. Returning to the article, Verhagen references the sociologist Richard Sennett and notes that when collectivity gives way to competition in the workplace, adults display childish outbursts of temper. She got a new office chair and I didn't. They tell white lies, resort to deceit, delight in the downfall of others, and cherish petty feelings of revenge. This is the consequence of a system that prevents people from thinking independently and that fails to treat employees as adults. Again, it's a curiosity that competition is touted as inherently efficient when it results in absolute waste in the form of office politics. There is a type of black and white or one-dimensional thinking to neoliberalism which dogmatically asserts that individualism and competition are inherently developmentally beneficial traits of society. Contrastingly, state action to encourage community and conviviality are dismissed as mollycoddling. The development of maturity in a person requires both the ability to think independently as well as the ability to trust others. There is no quicker way to quell the possibility of contemplation than to instill in every person the instinct to treat every other person as a means rather than as an end in themselves. One economic concept which runs throughout Brave New World, although is never explicitly named, is planned obsolescence. Lenina repeats the hypnopediacally ingrained mantra, "The more stitches, the less riches," a comical inversion of make do and mend. The implication is that in order to create enough demand for an economically productive society, the inhabitants of Brave New World have been indoctrinated to reject clothing which lasts too long. Linda, who was previously an inhabitant of the world state but now lives in a savage reservation, one of the few areas which exists in a primitive state, even remarks, "And look at these clothes. This beastly wool isn't like acetate. It lasts and lasts, and you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn." The director of hatcheries and conditioning explains earlier in the novel how conditioning or indoctrination is a form of economic policy. Gammas, deltas, and epsilons were conditioned to appreciate nature in order to compel them to consume transport and therefore increase economic demand. The director of the hatchery explains that "we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport, hence those electric shocks." Planned obsolescence is a term that was coined in 1932, the same year that Brave New World was published. Brooke Stevens, an industrial designer, explained the term as instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. This is precisely the economic principle in use when the denizens of Brave New World are indoctrinated to believe that they should always throw away old clothes. Ending is better than mending. The principle in our own time that comes most to mind is that of fast fashion. Rather than being explicitly dictated from a centralized government, the coercive laws of competition ensure that the most disposable and short-lived goods are the most profitable. Apple has been fined for intentionally slowing down old iPhones, a tactic they use to waste perfectly fine goods and materials for the sake of profit. Clothing brands have been found to deliberately manufacture women's tights so that they will ladder in order to drive more sales. There is also the economic concept of marginal difference, where the consumer goods which are manufactured are virtually identical but different enough to encourage unnecessary purchases. In all these cases, governments are not the ones ensuring the short lifespan and low quality of consumer products. As Adorno and Horkheimer explain, that the difference between the Chrysler range and General Motors products is basically illusory, strikes every child with a keen interest in varieties. What connoisseurs discuss as good or bad points serve only to perpetuate the semblance of competition and range of choice. The same applies to the Warner Brothers and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer productions. Under neoliberalism, it is the corporations such as tech companies, rather than the state, who have correctly identified the quality and endurance of their own products as barriers to the realization of profit and perpetuate the semblance of competition and the range of choice. In Brave New World, marriage and monogamy no longer exist. They are both in fact taboo. This prohibition is best portrayed in a scene where Lenina is berated by a friend. Fanny asks who Lenina is going out with, and she replies that she's been seeing Henry Foster for 4 months. Fanny is shocked that there's been nobody else except Henry all that time. Fanny goes on to say that it's such a horribly bad form to go on and on like this with one man. This scene is essentially a comic inversion of the traditions of society, especially in 1930s Britain. In a conservative society, you would expect a young woman to be chastised for sleeping around instead of finding someone to settle down with. But in Brave New World, the exact opposite is the case. Mustafa Mond explains the societal opposition towards traditional relationships, describing family, monogamy, romance as everywhere exclusiveness and narrow channeling of impulse and energy. He then cites the hypnopedic proverb, everyone belongs to everyone else. In our own time, the relationship dynamics of Brave New World seem to some extent to mirror the recent popularity of polyamory as an alternative to traditional monogamous relationships. This is not to say that polyamory is merely a result of neoliberal ideology. There are legitimate concerns to be had with the institution of marriage and monogamy, with them being used as a tool for the oppression of women for centuries. Even in the 21st century, there is an argument to be made that marriage is to some extent a means to enforce the reproduction of society in the form of the nuclear family. However, with the neoliberal shift in the 1980s, polyamory can be seen as a reflection of the prevailing economic and ideological doctrine within the context of love. In the Middle Ages, it was generally expected that one who worked in a craft would likely stay within that role for their entire life. The vestigial remnants of this persist in our surnames: Smith, Fletcher, Mason, etc. One's identity was often bound up in what type of labour one did, since this was generally so unchanging. Families would remain in the same craft for generations. However, since the upheavals of industrialization, the artisanal structure has been replaced with the specialization of labour. As technologies change more and more frequently, a worker can no longer expect to be able to remain within the same trade, and must switch out of necessity. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, median employee tenure in 2022 was about 4 years. Of course, this does not necessarily mean switching to a different trade, but often it can, as certain jobs become obsolete. Within neoliberalism, this necessity of individual flexibility increases as the ability of workers to use trade unions to secure stable jobs has eroded, and deregulatory policies such as zero-hours contracts lead to the increase of gig economy jobs, which often employs those who have just lost their jobs in their old trade. The psychological demand of this is an ability to be hyper-flexible, to not commit to one single skill or trade for fear it will become obsolete. The flexibility of the labour market is touted to be a form of freedom and an overcoming of being limited to a single job or trade. But this overlooks the devaluing of skilled labour, which occurs when flexibility is demanded. Freedom of choice is one of the core tenets of neoliberal ideology, but this freedom normally takes the form of the employer's freedom to exploit labour, rather than the freedom granted to workers by job security. So the ability or demand to change jobs frequently is seen as an overcoming of being limited to a single job, which is then sold to us as freedom. One can parallel this with the logic of polyamory, where limiting oneself to a single person is seen as simply being unfreedom, rather than enjoying relationships with many people. Again, this is not to suggest that polyamory cannot equally have a subversive or anti-capitalist effect, but one should remain vigilant to the fact that polyamory, and in fact any social structure, can easily be subsumed into neoliberal ideology. In February 2024, Tyler Austin Harper wrote an article for The Atlantic titled "Polyamory, the Ruling Class's Latest Fad." He identifies how polyamory and open relationships have become a popular topic in both entertainment and in journalism. He cites the philosopher Charles Taylor, who sees Western societies as being defined by a generalized culture of authenticity or expressive individualism, in which people are encouraged to find their own way, discover their own fulfillment, do their own thing. Harper then explains that, like good libertarians, the elegant polyamorists mostly seem to believe that any intervention or imposition on personal freedom is an intolerable affront that must be deregulated. In this sense, the version of polyamory espoused by the upper classes, which is often the version of polyamory we are shown in the media, seems to mirror the neoliberal ethic of individual liberty above all. Monogamy is perceived as only another barrier to the realization of the sovereign individual, rather than a limitation which makes love possible. So after this survey of the society of Brave New World, in contrast and comparison with our own, it becomes clear that an all-powerful technocratic state is not the only road to Brave New World. Precisely the opposite. A state which cedes its territory to the free market can have very much the same impact, possibly even more so. To be sold freedom in the sense of limitless commodity exchange is to be sold unfreedom. In the realms of technology, media, economics, culture, and love, immaturity and infantilization is prevailing through the need to realize profit. Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment as man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. We must now recognize that everywhere, more and more so, the unbridled forces of market mechanism impose this immaturity on society, and furthermore, we must resist the temptation to accept neoliberalism's siren song. We must reject the demand to treat each other as a means to an end, and instead treat one another as an end in ourselves.